This is William Michael, the headmaster of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and today is Sunday, August 1st. Normally on Sundays, I like to limit my meditations to topics that are explicitly religious or theological. And today I posted a talk that I recorded yesterday on how to react reasonably to objections to the Catholic faith. I posted that yesterday, and as I worked through that, I realized that one of the reasons why I think Catholics struggle to respond reasonably is not only because they haven't studied the faith carefully, but also because the art of reasoning is not taught in modern schools. And for all their talk of being truth lovers and lovers of learning, Christians in 2021 are just as poorly educated as anyone else. When I talk to parents, I often tell them the most important study in all of Catholic education is not the catechism, it's not mathematics, it's not any literature, it's not even classical languages. The most important study in all of education is the study of the art of reasoning. Because the art of reasoning is the art of learning, it's the art of problem solving, it's the art of investigation, it's the art of debating. The art of reasoning is the most important lesson, the most important study in all of education. Now, in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, I like to lead students through the classic work, the master text on the art of reasoning, which is Aristotle's Organon. And that's a series of books. And I teach it through a series of courses in the Academy, Classical Reasoning 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. A series of courses in which we study through a series of books that were written around 350 BC. And in those books, Aristotle presents to the world for the first time in human history the art of reasoning. It's an incredible achievement. We can look at that book and wonder why God would allow that doctrine to take so long to be established and explained. And yet there it is, we see it produced by this man, Aristotle, who, as one writer on reasoning said rightly, Aristotle is a rare example of a man who is both the originator or inventor of an art and also the perfecter and master of that same art. An incredible human being who lived a life filled with the most important and incredible achievements, earning him the title of the philosopher by St. Thomas Aquinas. But what it was that made Aristotle so great was not his writing on all of the different branches of philosophy, because the only reason he was able to write on all the branches of philosophy was because he was the master of the art of reasoning. And reasoning was the method by which he was able to investigate all of those different branches of philosophy and establish the sciences that he did. And so the most important study in all of education, the study that separates the wise from the ignorant, is the art of reasoning, and it's studied in Aristotle's organon. Now, one problem with the organon, which I explained to the boys who were with me in the boarding school some years back, the problem with the organon is because Aristotle was presenting something new to the world. Because he was presenting something new, and because as he established the art of reasoning, he had to disagree with different accepted ideas in his day. The organon had to do two different things. First, it had to teach the art of reasoning, as Aristotle had discovered it. It had to positively teach the art of reasoning. But secondly, it had to prove that it was in fact the true art of reasoning. It had to demonstrate its own truth. And in many of the points, in many of the parts of the organon, Aristotle is spending a lot of time proving the truth of the principles that he is teaching, which make up the art of reasoning. And so his work had two different objectives. First, to teach, and second, to prove. This makes the study of the organon quite difficult. There's a lot to study. And the reason why it's worth studying is because for the student who does the work, he will not only learn the art of reasoning, but he will be certain that it's trustworthy, because he'll also study the proofs for it. And that's what makes it possible for a man to be a master of the art of reasoning. He'll know both the principles of the art and the proofs of those principles. After all, no one should ever accept an assertion without proof, especially on an important subject like reasoning or philosophy. So the art of reasoning is studied formally for mastery through the study of Aristotle's organon, which again we teach in the academy through 5 classical reasoning courses. It's a big deal. But this is the knowledge, this is the art that separates the wise man from everyone else. The most important of all studies is the art of reasoning. However, while the study of Aristotle's organon is difficult, and no one can be considered a master of the art of reasoning until he has proven himself to have studied Aristotle's organon. The main idea of Aristotle's organon, the main idea of the art of reasoning, is very simple to understand. The main idea of the art of reasoning, the idea on which the entire art is based, is very easy to understand. And yet, most people don't understand it because since the science is complicated, schools don't offer it, schools don't teach it. The teachers don't even know it because the science is complicated. And therefore they don't even know that the principle of it, the main idea of it, is simple and can be easily taught to students. And while those students will not be masters of the art of reasoning, understanding the principle can change their lives, can protect them from a million errors, and can be used by them with some caution to investigate all sorts of subjects and questions throughout life, whether in academic circles or in any area of life. And so in this talk, what I'd like to do is provide students, or provide anyone listening, I guess it's very valuable for parents as well to learn this, and anyone else who listens, not just students. Hopefully students will have the opportunity to study the art in all of its detail with me in the academy, but just to be helpful in general, because I see so many errors made by Christians because they don't know the basic things about historic Christian learning or philosophy. And they get all riled up by online celebrities and political activity, and they begin to actually think they're really, really clever and smart, and yet they don't know the basics, and they contradict them in their own talk, which is one of the reasons why these Christian political movements and different groups rise and fall so frequently. You can have an appearance of Christian wisdom, but you're going to get caught one day. And therefore we have to be willing to put in the effort to obtain the real thing, and then allow that to work itself out in our lives and give us true wisdom, and allow us to pursue the truth wisely, that we might actually obtain it and enjoy it. So what I'd like to do in this talk today is simply present to you the main idea, the basic and essential principle of the art of reasoning. And if you understand this, and if you discipline yourself to think and speak according to this principle, you'll see that it will transform your life. It will protect you from many errors. It will help you to solve problems, and it will help you to communicate. It will help you to speak persuasively to others, because you'll actually understand what needs to be done, how reasoning actually works. And if you know the truth, you'll be able to persuade others of it as far as reasoning allows. Remember that reasoning is not the only influence in persuasion. There are 3 persuasive appeals, 3 different influences on our will. Reasoning is only one of them. But the goal of communication, which is learned in the art of rhetoric, is to exhaust all available modes of persuasion so that you can say that you've done your job as far as communication is concerned. So I'd like to share with you in the simplest and clearest terms the essence or the basic principle, the main idea of the art of reasoning. Now, to paint a little bit of a background or a context for this, when we study the Catechism, we learn that man was created in the image of God. This is taught directly in sacred scripture, and it's explained for us by the tradition of the Church. We learn that man is created in the image of God, and we then learn that this likeness does not exist in our body, but this likeness exists in our soul. In our bodies, we're comparable to other creatures. But our soul separates us from all other creatures and makes us, in some ways, like God. We're made in the image and likeness of God, and this likeness exists primarily in the soul. And we learn in the Catechism that there are some characteristics present in the soul, and that these are what make us like God. First of all, our souls live forever. Our souls will never die. They are like God in that they will live forever. They're eternal. Second, we learn that our souls possess understanding. They're intelligent. We possess the faculty of reasoning. And in this intelligence and understanding, our souls are like God. And thirdly, we have free will. And in this, we are like God. So eternity, understanding, and free will are those attributes which make our souls like unto God. Now, eternity is easy to understand, and free will is studied more effectively in ethics. But I'd like to focus on this second quality of the soul, which is understanding, and especially as it relates to reasoning. We learn that we're like God in our ability to understand and to reason. In the Old Testament, God actually says to us, "Come and let us reason together." Come, let us reason together. God cannot say that to any other creature, perhaps to an angel, but no other bodily creature, I should say, no other physical creature can God say, "Come, let us reason together." I can't say to my dog, "Come, let us reason together." The ability to reason is something shared between God and man alone. And yet, Men, in their foolishness and laziness, in their lack of virtue, they don't cultivate this faculty of reasoning because they're not concerned with being like God. They're often living more like animals, just seeking to avoid pain and to satisfy desires that they have, physical desires they have. They live like animals rather than like God. And this is one of the marks of fallen man. But if man were to say, I want to be like God, I want to act more like God, he would have to become more reasonable. He would have to cultivate and exercise this faculty of reasoning, this power of his soul, which makes him like God. If we look at a modern school curriculum, we see that reasoning is not even included among the subjects. And if we look at some modern program that calls itself classical, we'll find that they don't study the organon of Aristotle. They just play around with fallacies, for example, because they make people feel clever, even though without having learned the art of reasoning, students can't understand what the fallacies truly are, and they often refer to them incorrectly because they don't know what they're talking about. For example, one example of what's commonly called a fallacy is the hasty generalization. The hasty generalization. And what this is an attempt to move from some particular knowledge to draw a conclusion about an entire class of things that's not justified. A hasty generalization. So, if I meet 3 Chinese men, and those 3 Chinese men are all very short, and I were to draw the conclusion and say, all Chinese people are short, that would be an example of a hasty generalization. Now we could say that based on more research, based on more observation, the conclusion could be proven false by observation alone. If we went and found 100 more Chinese men, we might find that some are very tall. And our observation would prove the conclusion that all Chinese people are short is false. But the argument itself is unreasonable, because we cannot move from particular knowledge to a universal conclusion. That's unreasonable. That's what a hasty generalization is. However, some people who think they're clever and pretend that they have studied the art of reasoning and that they're logical will use or will accuse someone of making a hasty generalization anytime they make a generalization. So if instead of saying all Chinese people are short, if I don't include the all, if I don't say every Chinese person is short, but I simply say Chinese people are short, and everyone understands that I mean that in a general way in comparison to other races. If I say Chinese people are short, I'm not making a universal statement. I'm making a simple generalization. And sometimes people will react and say, aha, I caught you using a fallacy. That's a generalization. But the problem is, generalization is not a fallacy. And this is the kind of fake arguing that pretenders will do, because they don't actually know the art of reasoning. They've just studied some paperback book that talks about fallacies, and they read this little 100-page book or watch a few YouTube videos, and then they're off imagining that they're Sherlock Holmes or Socrates. And they don't even understand the details of what these fallacies are. Modern schools, including classical schools, or including schools that call themselves classical, don't teach the art of reasoning. Because in their set of goals, in their worldview, in their ambitious plans, being like God is not a concern. And yet for anyone who seeks true wisdom, who really seeks to possess true wisdom, not somebody who just desires to appear clever or well-read or witty, but someone who actually wants to possess true wisdom, the art of reasoning has to be studied, because the truth of it is subtle. The subtleties are where the truth lies. The devil, St. Ignatius of Loyola says, is a sophist. The devil is a sophist. He's a deceiver. We see him in the Garden of Eden deceiving Eve. He's a deceiver. And the way that a deceiver works is by causing something to appear to be what it's actually not. The whole idea of deception is to move people, persuade people by the cunning use of appearances. And therefore, we can see that the ability to resist these deceptions, the ability to guard ourselves against sophists, whether it's the devil himself or others who are his children who do the works of their father the devil, in order for us to protect ourselves from deception, we have to know the art well enough to understand the subtleties of it. Because it's going to be in the subtleties that the truth and falsehood is found. Think about if a person tries to pass a counterfeit dollar, let's say a $100 bill. If someone tries to pass a $100 bill, they don't hand something that was made on construction paper with some crayons. They prepare something that looks very much like a real $100 bill. And the reason why counterfeit money works is because it appears to be a real $100 bill. And for most people who don't know the subtleties of true currency, they'll look at it, it will have the appearance of a $100 bill, and that will be all they need to accept it. The truth and the error is in the subtleties. And an expert in recognizing counterfeits will know specific, subtle issues to look for. And if you look at real money, you'll see that built into the real money are subtle marks that can be looked for if one learns what to look for. There are subtle marks to look for by one who has learned what to look for. And sometimes even these can be mimicked. And therefore, a true master will not simply need to know one or two marks by which the true currency can be identified, but he'll need to know all of the marks. Because what if there are 12 different marks of true currency and the counterfeiter is able to imitate 9 of them? And only the person who knows all 12 will be able to discern that it's actually counterfeit. That's how reasoning works. The devil is a sophist. He's a counterfeiter. But he counterfeits everything. And he presents appearances to us. And if we're not trained in the subtleties of discernment, we won't be able to discern the errors. Now, it's possible that God will always protect us from too great a deception, because God says in the scriptures that He'll never allow us to be tempted beyond our ability. In other words, if God were to allow us to be tempted beyond our ability, as He understands it, not as we necessarily understand it, but as God knows our ability, if God were to allow us to be tempted beyond our ability, we wouldn't be culpable, or we couldn't be judged to be guilty of sin if we had no ability to resist. For example, if someone launched an atomic bomb and shot me in the face with an atomic bomb, and it exploded, and I didn't resist it or overcome it, no one would call me weak because I couldn't resist or overcome the power of an atomic bomb. Or if I was jumped by 20 men and couldn't fight them off and protect myself, no one would call me weak because I couldn't defeat an attack of 20 men. And in the same way, Scripture tells us that God will not judge us, or God will not allow us to be tested by the devil with a trial or deception that we would have no ability to overcome. But, as I said, our ability is not determined by what we think of ourselves, but what God actually knows to be true of us. Many times, someone will do something sinful and then say, "Oh, well, I didn't mean to," or "Oh, I didn't know that." And only God knows whether what they say is true or not. But if we're serious about truth, and if we obey the Scripture which tells us to be sober, knowing that our enemy, the devil, prowls about like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour, we will study to be like God, to protect ourselves against the wiles or the stratagems of the devil, so that we can discern truth from error, what's genuine from what's counterfeit, and we can be like God. Any wise person will pursue this study so that he can live in the image and likeness of God. So we have to watch out for fake logic classes, fake logic teachers who don't study the art of reasoning but oversimplify it and lead kids to think that they're a lot more discerning than they actually are. That's a problem with these modern schools. They puff the kids up to imagine that they're all master communicators or master evaluators because they've learned a few lessons in reasoning. And that's simply a recipe for disaster. St. Paul warns and says, if any man thinks that he stands, let him take heed lest he fall. When we believe that we're strong, when we believe that we're smart, that's when we're in trouble. When we know that we're in danger, when we know that our enemy is more cunning than we can imagine, and we live soberly and carefully, that's when we're wise. It's true that we can overcome any temptation, but it's only true in God. With God, all things are possible. It's not true of us ourselves as human beings. And God said to St. Paul, "My grace is sufficient for you." We're able to overcome all things not by our own self-conceit or self-confidence, but by our dependence on God, both in God's Word, in the authority and truth of the Church, and in God's commandments, which lead us always to safety. So I will never present this simple lesson here without clarifying that no one should take this as some kind of Cliff's Notes or shortcut to the knowledge of the art of reasoning. I simply want to introduce the basic principle or main idea of the art of reasoning to help Christians be a little more careful. And that's enough context and background. Let's get to the actual content. Now, as I said before, for hundreds of years, thousands of years, men stumbled around in the darkness trying to understand how reasoning works. And one of the real concerns was that men who figured out some of the details of the art of reasoning, men who were called sophists in history, were able to use their expertise in reasoning to dupe people, to trick people. And these men became influential speakers, influential advocates in court systems or court settings, speakers in political settings. And these men would intentionally manipulate audiences, manipulate judges, and they were rewarded financially for their ability to bring about some desired result. But they did so by deception, by using some knowledge of the art of reasoning as a means of misleading people. Good and wise men saw what was being done, and they worked to try to figure out if an art could be established that would allow them to understand what these men were actually doing, why it was working, so that they could then instruct people to understand what was going on inside their head, watch out for it, and catch it when it happens. This became especially important in Greek history because the Greeks experimented with democracy. And this sophistry became very dangerous because it could influence the entire population and affect votes and elections, mislead an entire nation or city at that time. And so the wise men worked to try and figure out how the sophists were doing what they were doing, and if they could establish an art of reasoning that they could teach to people to allow them to discern these errors, and also so that they could demonstrate the truth. One of the great advancements in this history was the dialectical method used by Socrates. And again, this is not to be confused with the nonsense that people talk about in modern classical schools where they say you can teach classes to students with the Socratic method. That's just ignorant nonsense talk. That has nothing to do with the Socratic method. That's just a deceptive way of marketing class discussion when we have teachers who don't have the expertise to present organized instruction. And we give jobs to incompetent teachers who can't lecture effectively, who can't teach students efficiently, but just want to be paid to babble in class and call it the Socratic method of teaching, as if that's what Socrates did. He simply had conversations with people. That's foolishness. Socrates made a very significant step in the development of the art of reasoning in the method. Remember, it's called a method because it's actually a method. There's no method in having a class discussion or asking people questions. What Socrates developed was very significant historically because it was a real method of investigation in philosophical questions. Socrates did not figure out how the truth could be demonstrated. And this is why his achievements are limited, and why the Socratic method is not that impressive in the first place. Socrates did not figure out how the truth could be demonstrated. But what he did figure out was how false beliefs in others could be revealed, or how men could be made conscious of errors in their thinking by questioning them in a way that led through their own granted premises into contradictions that could only be explained by something being false that they had admitted. And this is the Socratic method, to prove that a man's principles from which he reasons cannot be true. That's the Socratic method. To create doubt in the mind of a man. And this is why when Socrates said he was the wisest man alive, he basically meant that he was the only one who doubted his own knowledge, doubted that he had all the answers. And to become wise in Socrates' day simply meant to learn to doubt that you had it figured out, because the truth was yet to be revealed. And so Socrates' method introduced doubt in the ancient world, which left men open to learn rather than simply try and do their own will. And you can see how Socrates helped prepare for the coming of Christ by filling the classical world with a sense of doubt, that they weren't certain that their traditions, their myths, their legends, their religions were true. But after Socrates, Plato continued, largely by means of the Socratic method, continued these dialectical investigations. But it was Aristotle who cracked the code. Aristotle was the one who figured out how the truth can be positively demonstrated. Aristotle was the one who discovered the true essence of the art, of the power of reasoning. And the essence of the art of reasoning is what Aristotle called the syllogism. Syllogism. And I'll spell it for you here if you're listening. S-Y-L-L-O-G-I-S-M. S-Y-L-L-O-G-I-S-M. Syllogism. The syllogism was the key that unlocked the whole art of reasoning. The syllogism is what explains what it means to reason. The syllogism was the key by which the sophists' false arguments could be unlocked and solved. And the syllogism was the key that also allowed a wise man to not only teach, but demonstrate the truth of his teaching. And I should also say the syllogism was the key that allowed for the investigation of any subject area. And that's why Aristotle went on to become the master in all different branches of philosophy. The syllogism is a series or a collection of 3 sentences The syllogism is a collection of 3 sentences. We don't start with 3 sentences. We start with 2. 2 sentences called premises. And these sentences are of a certain quality, not just any 2 sentences. These sentences have to be propositions. A proposition is a sentence, a statement that's capable of being true or false. It has to be an indicative or declarative sentence. Cannot be a question, cannot be a wish, cannot be a command. Must be a declarative or indicative sentence. It must be capable of being true or false. So a syllogism is a group of sentences. We start with 2 sentences or propositions, to be more exact. 2 propositions. And these 2 propositions, when presented to our minds, and this is something that's built into our nature as human beings. This is something that God created in us. This power where when 2 propositions are present in our mind, and these 2 propositions have a certain relationship, our mind is able to draw or produce a 3rd proposition from them that must be true, if they are true. Let me summarize that for you. A syllogism is a group of 3 propositions where the first 2 being true, the 3rd necessarily arises from them. A syllogism is a group of propositions, a group of 3 propositions, where the first 2 being true, the 3rd necessarily arises from them. The key word is necessarily, and I emphasized it when I said it. When these 2 propositions are present in the mind, by this power of reasoning, immediately recognizes that those 2 sentences require, or I should say, those 2 propositions produce instantly a 3rd proposition. And if those 2 propositions are true, that 3rd proposition must also be true. And I'll give you an example that will make this crystal clear. So this is the syllogism. I've defined it for you a couple times. You can just back up a few minutes and listen again to hear the definition of the syllogism again. But here's an example that will make this crystal clear. Let's say that there are 2 propositions in my mind. The first proposition is that all men are mortal. All men are mortal. Now, the truth of this may be uncertain because I haven't had the opportunity to observe or learn about all men. But the statement is, all men are mortal, or all men die. All men are mortal. And if I were to investigate this proposition by observation, I would find that it's true. And let's say a second proposition was present in my mind. And the second proposition was, Socrates is a man. So these two sentences are present in my mind, two propositions. All men are mortal, and Socrates is a man. Now, what immediately happens in the human mind is that this faculty of reasoning discerns, sort of an alarm goes off, and discerns that there's something special about these two assertions. There's some relationship that exists between them. All men are mortal, and Socrates is a man. And the power of reasoning acts upon these two propositions and finds, like a computer program, finds that a third proposition exists within these two propositions and must necessarily be produced. And that third proposition is what? I'll say them again. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, it is necessary that Socrates is mortal. That conclusion is necessarily produced by those two propositions. And those three propositions taken together form what Aristotle called a syllogism. And the syllogism is the key to understand the art of reasoning. Two propositions being true, a third necessarily arises from them. That is the process. That is the operation of reasoning. Reasoning, what's so amazing about reasoning, what's so powerful about reasoning is that if we know two things, and only two things, our mind can learn a third thing. And now we have three propositions that can be used in conjunction with other propositions to draw new conclusions and create new knowledge. This is the power of the art of reasoning. And I'd like to, so far I've given you a definition of the syllogism, and I've given you an example of the syllogism. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. I'd like to now give you an illustration that I can communicate in words that you can imagine in your minds, and this illustration that I'm going to give you is the key to thinking reasonably, and this illustration will always protect you from being deceived. And here's what I'd like you to think of. I'd like you to think of a big circle. Let's imagine a whiteboard and draw a big circle on that board. So imagine in your mind a big circle drawn on a whiteboard. And you're going to label that circle mortal things. Mortal things. Because mortal is an adjective. So we have to identify a substantive. So we're going to draw a circle and label that circle mortal things. And in that circle, we're to understand all mortal things that exist to be contained within that circle. All mortal things that exist are to be understood to be contained in that circle. So we have this image, a circle that marks all mortal things. Now I want you to imagine another circle, a smaller circle, drawn inside, completely inside that circle. So imagine the big circle, mortal things, and inside that big circle, a smaller circle drawn, and label that circle men. And you have this simple illustration. A large circle labeled mortal things, and inside that circle, a smaller circle labeled men. That illustration shows us the first proposition. All men are mortal. All men are mortal. The entire circle or class of men are contained within the greater circle of mortal things. All men are mortal. So we have the proposition spoken or communicated in words, but we also have this mental image of the entire class of mortal things containing the entire class of men. All men are mortal. Now, I'd like you to imagine if we were to draw a dot inside the circle of men. Just draw a dot with that marker inside the circle of men and label that dot Socrates. We've now illustrated the second proposition. Socrates is a man. And now we've got this image, this large circle labeled mortal things, this smaller circle drawn inside that larger circle that's labeled men, and a dot inside that circle labeled Socrates. And that dot represents the second proposition. Socrates is a man. Now, step back from that whiteboard and imagine what's on it. If we see that the circle of all men is inside the circle of mortal things, and the dot, Socrates, is inside the circle of men, we can also see that that dot is inside the circle mortal things. And so if Socrates is a man, then Socrates is also mortal. And that illustration, a large circle containing a smaller circle containing a dot, is an example of a syllogism. That illustration shows us how reasoning works, how simple it is. And that's the key, the essential idea to the art of reasoning, what our minds actually do when we reason. And in this operation of our mind, or we could even better say, this operation of our soul, we are like God. And we see that the truth of that argument, that Socrates is a mortal, is indisputable. It's absolutely certain. If it's true that the entire circle of men are inside the circle of mortal things, then it is absolutely true that Socrates is immortal. That's the syllogism. That's the essence of the art of reasoning. Now I'd like to present a second argument. So erase the whiteboard, clear that image, and start again with a clean whiteboard in your mind. And first, let's identify the second argument in words. And here's what I'd like you to write in words. Some men are African. Some men are African. And let's draw that. So let's start with a big circle, and we'll label that circle Africans. We'll label that circle Africans. And then we read, some men are Africans. So what we're going to do is draw another circle, and we can draw this circle to be bigger than the African circle, or smaller, or the same size. It doesn't matter. We don't know that from the sentence itself. But all that we know is that some men are Africans. So what we're going to do is draw a circle where part of the circle is inside the African circle, and the other part of the circle is outside the African circle. So we start with the large African circle, and then we draw a second circle where part of the circle is inside the African circle and part of the circle is outside. And we don't know how much is inside, how much is outside. It doesn't say. We just know that some men are Africans. Some men. Okay, so you should have that illustration. A large circle titled or labeled Africans, and a second circle half or partly inside the African circle, partly outside the African circle, labeled men. And that illustration shows us some men are Africans. Now, if I were to say to you, take the marker and draw a dot inside men and label it Socrates, where would you draw it? If all that you knew was Socrates is a man, where would you draw that dot? Would you draw that dot inside the African circle or outside the African circle? Some men are Africans. Socrates is a man. So Socrates exists in the circle of men. But where would you draw that dot? Would you draw that dot inside the African circle or outside the African circle? The answer is, we don't know. And because we don't know where to draw the dot, we can't draw the dot. If we draw it inside the circle, that would lead our minds to a third proposition. And we'd say, aha, Socrates is an African. But that could be false. If we drew it outside the circle, outside the African circle, we would say, aha, Socrates is a man. Socrates is not an African. And if we were to then observe Socrates, we would say, that's true. The problem is our illustration would not be reasonable. Because the two sentences do not lead necessarily to the conclusion. And that is not a syllogism. Because a syllogism cannot begin with a partial proposition or a particular proposition. The first sentence in a syllogism cannot be some men are. And so we can't, based on those two propositions, we can't finish our diagram. And we can't draw a conclusion. Because we can't reason from that particular proposition. Remember the definition of a syllogism. Two propositions being true, a third necessarily arises from them. The conclusion, Socrates is an African, does not necessarily arise from the two statements. Some men are Africans, Socrates is a man. That does not necessarily lead to the third sentence that Socrates is an African. It also does not lead to the third sentence, Socrates is not an African. Those two propositions do not produce a syllogism. Now, if someone were to try and produce a syllogism from those two premises, that's the kind of place where deception is found. And the art of reasoning would... Now imagine someone draws the dot in the men circle for Socrates outside of the African circle and says, there, that's true. Now, you might look at that and say, that is true. But it's not reasonable. And you need to be able to discern that. That statement may be true, but it doesn't follow from those two propositions. Someone might also try to draw the dot of Socrates inside the African circle and say, there, some men are Africans, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates could be an African. Doesn't that sound logical? Some men are Africans. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates could be an African. Pretty logical, right? No, not logical. Because you forgot the definition of a syllogism. A proposition has to be a declarative sentence, an indicative statement. That's true or false. To say that Socrates could be an African is not an indicative statement. It's a potential statement. Now you could say, well, isn't it true though that Socrates could be an African? Yes, but we could have said that without any premises. We could have just said that off the top of our heads. That conclusion has nothing to do with those two premises. It's not reasonable. Now, erase the board and let's look at a third set of sentences. So clear that illustration and think of this. No men are four-legged. No men are four-legged. We could also say something like, no men are winged. No men are winged. But we'll say no men are four-legged. So let's draw the big circle and label it four-legged things. Four-legged things. That's our big circle. No men are four-legged. No men are four-legged. So we have to draw another circle outside, entirely outside of the four-legged circle. And label that circle men. So we'll have two circles on the board that do not intersect at all. We'll have a circle for four-legged things, and we'll have a separate circle outside of that circle labeled men. And that illustration shows us that no men are four-legged. Now here comes our second proposition. Socrates is a man. Socrates is a man. Where do you draw the dot? Well, you draw it in the second circle, the men's circle. And you can draw it anywhere in that circle. Just put the dot in there and label it Socrates. We don't have the dilemma that we had in the second set of sentences because we have a universal statement again. No men are four-legged. And when we put the dot in the men's circle and label it Socrates, we can step back, look at the illustration that we've drawn, and reason can draw another conclusion. Reason will necessarily produce a third statement. What is it? Listen to the two premises. No men are four-legged. Picture the diagram. No men are four-legged. And here's the second premise. Socrates is a man. Picture the diagram. What else can be said? A third proposition necessarily arises by the action of reason that says Socrates is not four-legged. And that is the act of reasoning. So what I want you to see, and again remember, this is just the barest essential, but nevertheless the essential principle of the art of reasoning. The syllogism was Aristotle's great discovery. Two sentences being true, a third necessarily arises from them. In the first set of sentences, we saw all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, and reason immediately led to Socrates is mortal. In the second set of sentences, we saw some men are Africans, Socrates is a man, and that was it. No conclusion could be drawn. And if anyone attempted to add the third statement, it would be what's called an apparent syllogism, and that's sophistry. And then in the third set of sentences, we saw no men are four-legged. Socrates is a man. And reason instantly led to Socrates is not four-legged. And that idea of the syllogism is the essence or the most important principle of the art of reasoning. Now, you can imagine that if we change these sentences, we can make a million different kinds of diagrams. There could be all different situations. You'll see that some don't work, some are confusing, some are impossible, on and on. Once we get this essential idea, we can then dig into all of these different possible circumstances. And that's what we do in our study of Aristotle's organon. And that's why I said you have to beware of people who don't study the organon and who pretend to know the art of reasoning. Aristotle, being the master that he is, inexhaustible in his studies and work in instruction, goes on to study every imaginable circumstance, to consider whether or not a conclusion can be drawn from different sets of premises based on the quality of those premises or those propositions. And that's what we study in detail in the organon, in classical reasoning. But what I want you to see is this essential principle of reasoning. Because if you were to go on Facebook or watch the news or read an article in a newspaper or just examine your own thoughts, examine your own anxieties, your own temptations. Let's say something goes bad at work and you lose money, and all of a sudden the next thing you know, there's a letter in the mail from the bank, the mortgage company threatening this and this and this, and your heart starts to blow up with anxiety. You need to stop and consider whether the things in your head are in fact reasonable and true. Because the devil will manipulate your anxiety, your desires. He'll take advantage of them and present to you false arguments. He'll present to you arguments that appear, when you're not thinking carefully or calmly, to be true. And these false arguments will produce in you all kinds of anxieties and groundless fears, worries, false reactions, errors, bad decisions. And that's how he gets you. Not only will the devil do that, but other men will do that. The bill collectors will do that. The bill collectors will tell you things that appear to be true, but are not actually true, to create in you an anxiety or fear of some consequence that can't even happen. And they'll manipulate you to make a decision for their benefit that you'll later regret. People will say things in political discussions. And if you would take the time to write down their words and imagine what the diagram would look like, you would be able to discern that what they're saying is not true, that it's not reasonable, that no conclusion can be drawn from the propositions that they've stated. For example, when all of this vaccine craziness started, and I've talked about this recently, and people started saying things like, the vaccine is part of some conspiracy plan to destroy female fertility, or some act of genocide. Well, the problem is they were starting with a premise that cannot be assumed to be true because there's no evidence. And yet you, if you fell for that, you agreed to grant them that first premise. And then, once you granted them that first unproven, groundless fear, you gave them the power and opportunity to lead you to the conclusion that they desire. And it appeared reasonable to you because it seems, or in fact did, proceed from the two premises. But those two premises were not proven true. You granted one of them to be true. And you had no justification for doing so. You granted the truth to the sentence that you then believed to lead to a conclusion for which there was no evidence. You caused the conclusion to appear true by your own willingness to grant truth to a proposition that you had no business granting truth to. You are the source of your own deception. Now, why would someone do that? Because you're already prejudiced or predisposed to want something to be true. And the argument could go like this. Let's say that you hate the Democratic Party. You hate it. You believe everything they do is evil. You hate the Democrat Party. And someone comes along and says these two propositions. Number one, everything Democrats do is evil. And you grant that with your party political zeal. Yeah, that's right. Everything Democrats do is evil. Okay, thank you. Thank you for granting that first premise. Let's draw that big circle on the board. The big circle is evil. The second circle is democratic actions. And now, here's my second premise. The COVID vaccine is a democratic action. So where do you draw that? Well, you draw it inside that democratic action circle, and look, it's inside the evil circle. Therefore, the COVID vaccine is evil. And off you go. The problem is, you were not persuaded that that was true. You already decided that was true when you granted those premises to be true without any investigation. That's what prejudice is. That's what irrational judgment is. Unjust judgment. So what I'd like to challenge you to do, and I'm going to stop this talk now, I want you to become conscious of a couple of dangers. The first danger is granting truth to assertions that you are not able to actually verify. Because of how reasoning works, when you grant truth to any assertion, to any proposition, when you grant truth to it, when you accept it to be true, you allow arguments to be deduced from that proposition. And you should never do that. You have to be conscious of the danger of granting truth to statements that you have no ability to demonstrate to be true. And you'll see me, if you pay attention to my discussions with people on Facebook, and the reason that I do this is not because I care about what any of these crazy people say. I do it to show other people what they should do. And so if someone makes an assertion on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram, I will post and I'll say, give me the evidence that led you to know that assertion was true. Give me the evidence that led you, in your careful discernment, to conclude that that assertion was in fact true. And you will find that when I do that, the people who make these assertions do not have any evidence. I do that to show people what's wrong in these arguments. And I don't care what the argument is. I don't care if it's pro-life arguments. I don't care if they're vaccination arguments. I don't care if they're church arguments. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you're a Catholic. It doesn't matter if you're pro-life. It doesn't matter. If what you do is unreasonable, you have to stop it. Because you're going to get yourself trapped by doing that. You're going to be set up by a more cunning enemy who's going to use your carelessness to trap you and to confuse you because you're not sober, you're not careful, and you're going to get trapped. We see this happening right now. We see this happening with this vaccine issue. The people who are I'll just give you a quick example. The people who are pro-life are arguing against the government that they should not be made to take the vaccine because they're essentially saying, my body, my choice. And they think they're so clever to oppose the government, put their foot down and say, you have no right to tell me to get a vaccine. This is my body, my choice. And as that is coming out of their mouth, you can be sure that the devil and cunning politicians who will be revealed in the future will say, thank you for that. That's exactly what we needed to hear from you. We'll see you later when we're ready to argue for abortion. And we can't wait until you try to argue that the government has the right to tell a woman what she can and can't do with her body. We're going to play back your own words and blow up your pro-life argument with the words that you carelessly spoke as you reacted unreasonably to a different issue. And these people are going to be trapped. And you're going to see it happen, because this is what unwise, careless Christians do, and why so many anti-Christian ideas and practices succeed in this unreasonable, poorly educated society. The Christians defeat themselves. As they boast of their schools, as they boast of their SAT scores, their kids are studying calculus, their kids are studying chemistry, nobody gives a heck about reasoning. And they all stand around wondering, how the heck did abortion become legal in a Christian country? I can tell you how it became legal. By your modern education, suckers. You fell for it, and you got yourselves trapped, and you lost, and it's never going to be overturned, ever, because you blew it. And the essential mistake was allowing reasoning to be taken out of the curriculum. How could any Christian ever be suckered into accepting an educational program that was able to dump reasoning? Look at any Catholic school today. Look at any public school today. Look at any evangelical school today. Look at these silly, quote-unquote, classical schools that have no idea what they're even trying to do. They're telling kids that they should study Latin because it will help raise their SAT scores. Just craziness. No clue what the real goal of education is. So I want to warn you. Don't allow yourself to grant truth to any proposition. It is the duty of a person asserting something to prove it to you. If someone asserts something, you must ask for proof and refuse to grant that proposition until it's proven to you. If someone says something like, oh, these vaccines are full of poisons, don't you dare grant truth to that statement. Demand proof. Ask the person to clarify, wait a minute, are you saying that every vaccine has poisons in it? So you're saying all vaccines are poisonous. Is that what you're saying? And if the person agrees, then, okay, give me the evidence that proves the truth of this proposition, that all vaccines are poisonous. And you will immediately see that the devil in these false arguments runs away. Because once the devil knows that his scheme is discerned, he flees. And that's why Scripture tells us explicitly, resist the devil and he will flee from you. Ask for proof and watch how many people run away. You'll be amazed because you've just unmasked a devil. Ask for proof. Never grant truth to something someone else says. It's not your job to look it up. It's not your job to Google it. It's not your job to figure it out. If someone asserts something, make it their job to prove it. And you'll find all kinds of fake responses. They'll give you a link to a YouTube video. They'll give you a link to a book. They'll give you a link to a Wikipedia article. No. I'm asking you, Mr. Big Mouth, making the assertion to simply give me that proof which led you to accept this to be true. And you will find that they can't do it. Because they've never asked for proof themselves. Or because they're just trying to ram this down your throat. And if you interrupt them by asking for proof, they'll just block you or attack you or mock you and try to push you out of the room so they can continue with whatever suckers are present to go along with them. And this is what Christians do today. Christians. So that's the first thing. Don't grant truth to any statements unless you have proof. Second, anytime someone makes an argument, get out your marker and make a diagram. You'll often know because sophists don't speak in clear, logical terms. They leave things vague. They change words. They use words differently in different sentences or on different posts. They're not careful with their language. Sophists like ambiguity. They like confusion because their goal is to create apparent or false syllogisms. And you need to take out your marker or your pen and start diagramming what they're saying. And you'll find that it's very hard to diagram because when you really look at it, they're not really saying anything logical. And if you try to nail down what they're saying into some clear logical statement, you'll find that they're not willing to clarify. They're not willing to define a term. They're not willing to state their assertion in a way that can be examined, they like to keep everything vague. And you can use this discipline of diagramming arguments and statements to see what exactly are they saying, and you'll often find that what they say can't be diagrammed. They won't present arguments in the clear, simple format that I showed you before. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. If you know that argument, why would you not present it in that simple language? Why would you present it in some kind of vague, disordered, confusing language? That's the kind of stuff you need to watch out for. If a person loves the truth and is only concerned with the truth, he'll be eager to share his proof, to clearly articulate his arguments, because he will want them to be examined. Think of what we read in the Gospel of John. And I don't have the verse I don't think I have the verse word for word, but you can look it up and see the exact wording. But what it says is, those who do evil do not come to the light because they don't want their deeds to be seen. But those who do good, they come to the light because they want their good deeds to be seen. When people are seeking the truth with sincerity, they want their sentences and definitions and arguments to be examined because that's the strength of their case. The strength of their case is in the actual certainty of their definitions and arguments, the accuracy of their statements. That's the strength of the case of a man who is saying what's true. He wants his words to be examined because he is careful. He wants his arguments to be examined because he is reasonable. And he will be eager for that examination. Just like a wrestler who knows he's the best wrestler in the state will be eager for the match. He doesn't want to do the talk and the press conferences and all this nonsense. Forget all this hype and all this distraction. Let's get on the mat and let's just settle this thing because I know that I'm the best wrestler. The best wrestler wants the match to start. The truth seeker, the true teacher, wants his terms examined, his sentences examined. He is happy to clarify. He is happy to furnish his proof because his proof is right in his mind. How many times do you see me quote scripture or refer to examples? These things are right in my mind because they were present when I became persuaded. And I can tell you very simply, this is what persuaded me. This is what led me to this conclusion. This is what led me to know that this is true. I don't have to send YouTube videos or link to books or pretend like this kind of stuff. Oh, well, I can't say it as well as he does. You mean you can't articulate what you claim convinced you that this is true? You're telling me you can't articulate it? That's baloney. Baloney. If you had proof that led you to a conclusion, you can articulate it right on the spot. And you can trap these people. Because a truth seeker who is careful and true and reasonable would never do these things. Never, never, never. When you look at, just as a practical example, when you look at one of these fake classical Catholic study programs and they say something like, oh, well, throughout history, everyone homeschooled. If I were to ask them, what did you possibly read that led you to make the conclusion or make this assertion that in the old days everyone homeschooled? Where did you get that statement from? You'll find that there's no evidence for that anywhere because it's false. How then could they possibly dare to tell parents that in the old days everyone homeschooled? How could they possibly dare to say that knowing that when it came out of their mouth or when they typed it onto the page, there was not one piece of evidence to confirm that what they were telling parents was true? Truth seekers don't do that. And it's very easy to reveal whether a person is a truth teller or is simply trying to push something on you for his own benefit. Very, very easy to discern these things. And when you put your foot down and say, prove it, you'll find they want nothing to do with you. How many people have you ever seen respond to one of my talks or articles where I've made some pretty heavy accusations with proof against people? How many of you have ever seen a response? Never. Never. There's never a response. Why? They simply want to ignore it because they know that entering into that discussion is like stepping into the wrestling ring, and they don't want to be in the wrestling ring. So, I've got to cut this off because it's already an hour and 50 minutes. The essence of reasoning is the syllogism. I hope that that's helpful. Remember, to know all of the details of the art of reasoning, you have to study the art of reasoning. So, in being introduced to the concept of the syllogism, don't think more highly of yourself than you ought. You're not Aristotle now. Even though this may have been very helpful and you may feel like things are exploding inside your brain and this is so helpful, remember, it's just the most basic principle of the art of reasoning. It is very important. It is very helpful. And it will help you in 1,000 different ways every day if you're disciplined enough to think carefully and follow the advice that I gave you in this talk, to demand proof and to diagram people's statements and arguments so that they become clearer, and then ask them, is this what you're saying? Is this what you're saying? And try to get them to clarify. You'll see that these things are very helpful, but don't think you're now the new Thomas Aquinas. You're ignorant. You know very little. You've never studied the art of reasoning. I've been working in classical studies for 25 years, and I am barely getting into Aristotle's philosophy. These things are so profound. These works are so deep and filled with wisdom that we can't even comprehend because we're so dumb in modern society and have been so drawn away from true wisdom. Don't think more highly of yourself than you ought. Understand that this is just an introduction. Useful, yes. Helpful, yes. Exciting, yes. But just a little bit of the art of reasoning. I hope that's helpful. God bless.